This one you see here is my favorite superhero movie scene of all time. It's the opening credits of the Watchmen film. It interestingly summarizes the historical and social context of this universe in just a few scenes. This context made the Watchmen story great in the first place. However, many of these details were not found in the comic itself, but in the appendices that each issue contained. Moore presented snippets of books, reports, and fictional analysis of this fictional world. What Snyder did here was to summarize much of these appendices through very specific scenes that show us the rise of masked heroes, the arrival of a Superman named Dr. Manhattan. And how did these events change the course of history, creating a world radically different from ours, but which in some way continues to feel strangely familiar? Surprisingly, Snyder not only summarizes but also proposes interesting ideas not in the original comic. He recounts the history of superheroes through these characters. We first see selfless heroes who only want to fight crime. We see them become instruments of patriotic propaganda, political weapons, and then we see a new generation of heroes with other ideals. They make their appearance in a world that increasingly distrusts them. Crucially, this opening introduces the story's real superheroes and the fictional ones in our world, like pop culture ideals that somehow managed to change the world's history. The opening contains political, historical, and religious references. In this video, we will closely examine each of these scenes to see what they tell us about the world of Watchmen and also about ours. Because believe me, this opening is a real gem. Welcome to Go, the Geek Monitor, short bursts of geek culture to nourish your mind. Today we are going to dissect the beautiful opening of the Watchmen movie. Before we begin, I must inform you that there are only 6 spots remaining for my meet and greet talk in Mexico City, where I will be discussing about the history of superheroes. In this talk, I will speak to you about how superheroes have evolved from their mythological references to the movies we know today. If you're interested, the talk is this Saturday at 6, followed by mingling, drinks, and a good time. I'll leave a link in the description for you to get your tickets, a map, and an email in case you have any questions. Remember that I only have 6 places left, so if you're interested, I'll see you there. Now let's continue with the topic. In the first scene of the Watchmen opening, we see a character named Night Owl beating up some criminals and stopping a robbery. However, this is no ordinary robbery. He's rescuing Thomas and Martha Wayne, the parents of Bruce Batman. The scene is set in Gotham City outside an opera with a reference to Batman in the background, confirming the location. Canonically, the murder of the Waynes takes place coming out of a cinema, but directors like Nolan have placed the scene at the opera. The interesting thing here is that Night Owl, by saving Bruce's parents, prevents Batman from existing in this universe. While not directly influencing the story or scene in the Watchmen comic, it provides the sense of perceiving multiple layers of reality. I'm referring to the reality of DC Comics and the reality proposed in the Watchmen story, which originates from our own. Notably, the scene opens with the character who best embodies the golden age of masked heroes. Night Owl wasn't the first masked hero in Watchmen, but he is the one who best represents the ideals these heroes supposedly had. He was a police officer who simply wore the mask because he felt there were places where the legal system couldn't reach. A person of good intentions who stopped street crimes and helped the community. Opening the movie with him makes sense, not because he's the first hero, but because he best represents the American hero. An ideal that becomes distorted as the story progresses. In fact, that's exactly what happens in the next shot. Sally Jupiter is shown with the police and a newspaper discussing her deeds. The original comics annexes state that Sally Jupiter aided by her agent and future spouse Larry. They saw the masked heroes as a trend that could be exploited for commercial purposes. So they took the concept of the heroine called Silk Spectre to promote Sally's modeling career. On the other hand, the comic before Watchmen Minutemen goes a little further, and it says that Larry paid the police to let Sally catch an occasional criminal. The distorted hero ideal persists with the comedian, a sociopathic vigilante who enjoyed assaulting criminals and even abused Sally Jupiter. All these characters appear in the next shot, where we see the iconic photograph of the group known as Minutemen. However, if you only watch the movie, there might be some things that you did not fully understand about these characters. So who are the Minutemen in the story of Watchmen? The Minutemen were a group of masked heroes without powers within the Watchmen universe who fought crime during the 40s. This team refers to others like the Justice League or the Justice Society of America, who are often seen as heroes of incorruptible virtues. But here lies the big difference. What Moore wanted to do with the Minutemen was to tell us that these groups of heroes are far from being heroic. Captain Metropolis, Sally Jupiter, and Dollar Bill seek to be heroes for the fame it brings. The comedian and Hooded Justice fight crime due to their sociopathic addiction to violence. And only members like Night Owl, Mothman, and Silhouette are in the group for more heroic reasons, although they also have their own issues. Moore also talks about a great hypocrisy within their ranks, since the comedian wasn't brought to justice when he tried to abuse Sally for fear of bad press. And he talks about the expulsion of Silhouette for being a lesbian. Something that, according to the group, was against the team's morality, even though Captain Metropolis and Hooded Justice also had a secret relationship. This fashion of masked heroes soon gains strength and becomes a reference point in American culture. So we see Sally Jupiter painted on the side of the Enola Gay, the airplane that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. And this might sound exaggerated, but it was very similar to what happened in real life with superhero comics. Characters like Superman and Batman, whose stories initially had no nationalist or patriotic tones, were quickly converted into instruments of American propaganda during World War II. This scene from the Watchmen's opening is a reference to the famous photo by Alfred Eisenstadt during Victory Day, the parade that symbolized the victory of the Allied forces in World War II. According to the story of the original photo, an American Navy soldier spontaneously approached a nurse he didn't know and kissed her. The events were depicted in the iconic photograph that would later be published in Time magazine. But in the opening of Watchmen, it's Silhouette, the heroine who had just been kicked out of the Minutemen for her sexuality, who gives this spontaneous kiss to the nurse. Later, they are seen lifeless in a hotel room, reinforcing the central opening theme, the hypocrisy of American values in judging two people solely for their sexuality. And how can those symbols of an optimistic and bright past be more complex than we usually think? In the same way that Moore in the comic tells us that heroes are not always these virtuous people, Snyder reveals that the idealized past, often yearned for, was not without its shortcomings and inconsistencies. The American hero ideal starts to decline in subsequent scenes. For example, we see Dollar Bill lifeless, stuck in a revolving door after trying to stop a robbery. According to what Night Owl says in the Watchmen Annex biography, it was the banking company who designed his suit, and they thought the cape was a flashy element that could be commercially exploited. However, Night Owl himself asserts that if Bill had designed his own suit according to his needs, this wouldn't have happened. Likewise, Mothman's confinement to a psychiatric asylum signaled the start of the decline of the first superhero era. Then we have a religious reference because, well, Zack Snyder. This scene from the Watchmen opening refers to the painting of the last scene by Leonardo da Vinci. The scene occurs at Sally Jupiter's retirement party, as she is about to become a mother. Interesting details can be found if we pay attention. In the corner, we see Captain Metropolis and Hooded Justice talking intimately, who had a secret relationship. We see the silhouette with the nurse he met during the victory parade of World War II. And we see Sally's husband Larry taking on the role that Judas takes in the original painting. With the difference that on this occasion he is the betrayed rather than the betrayer. It's later revealed that Laurie Jupiter is actually the daughter of Eddie Blake, the comedian, not the man she thought was her father. Something that is hinted at through this complicit smile that Sally and Eddie share. After these scenes in which we're told how many of the characters end up, we are introduced to the birth of a second generation of heroes, and we are also told how some characters from the previous generation adapt to these changes. During the Cold War, the United States discovers that Russia also possesses nuclear weapons. A little boy named Walter Kovacs witnesses his mother prostituting herself in their home and begins to develop violent, racist, and misogynistic tendencies, to later become Rorschach. Meanwhile, we see President Kennedy shaking hands with Dr. Manhattan, the only character with powers within this universe, who immediately made atomic bombs obsolete, resulting in a time of great tension and resentment between the United States and the Soviet Union. Because it appears God exists and he's American. This is the point at which the American government begins to take these characters seriously and formalizes the cooperation between them. Ironically, in the next scene, it's Eddie Blake who commits the infamous crime against John F. Kennedy. November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas. Something interesting here is that Eddie is dressed in the same way as the real initial suspects of this crime. And the smoke from his cigar is a reference to the smoke over the fence that some witnesses claim to have seen that day. In the next scene, we see Sally and Larry arguing about Laurie's paternity, who watches them argue from the hallway. The scene also features crucial iconographic elements of the character, including the Silk Spectre costume and the snow globe, a recurring motif that evokes nostalgia within the comic. Lastly, the TV shows the Vietnamese monk Thich Quang Duc's self-immolation. This monk is in a street in Saigon as a form of protest against South Vietnam's policies and religious discrimination. In the next scene, we see two criminals tied up and beaten with Rorschach's card. An act that already speaks of a second age of masked heroes, a darker age where characters like Rorschach are closer to vigilantes than to classic heroes. Then we see a reference to the so-called missile crisis, a diplomatic conflict between the US and the Soviet Union over Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. It is said that this was the point in history when the world was closest to a third world war. Luckily, it was settled via talks. The following scene is a reference to a photograph called The Ultimate Confrontation, The Flower and the Bayonet by French photographer Marc Ribot. The photo was captured during a Vietnam War protest, and in it we see how a young student places a flower in the barrel of a rifle held by an American soldier. The image represents a counterposition between military violence, the desire for peace, and perfectly captures the spirit of the times. However, the Watchmen version changes, because here the soldier does fire the shot. Perhaps because in this universe, the American government is much more powerful, since it has God on its side. The following three scenes talk about masked heroes as cultural phenomena. One of my favorite details in the Watchmen film opening is how masked heroes are presented to us as pop culture icons, capable of influencing the politics and social context of their world. On the one hand, in this universe, Andy Warhol paints Night Owl as if it were a Campbell's soup or Marilyn Monroe, because here masked heroes are celebrated celebrities amidst a consumer society. So it's no surprise that Ozymandias is one of the many celebrities to attend the mythical Studio 54, along with other celebrities like Mick Jagger or David Bowie. Finally, Dr. Manhattan is on the moon with Neil Armstrong, which is quite intriguing. Not only because it places one of the Watchmen characters in the midst of one of humanity's most iconic moments, but because it makes us feel that the most important technological achievement of its time poses no challenge to the most powerful man in the world. I appreciate that the opening doesn't include these details which aren't in the comic. It not only adapts to the Watchmen story, but also adds elements that give the movie its own discourse. The sequence ends with a photo that is not in the comic referencing the Minutemen in the film adaptation. It is made to understand that the Watchmen were a second team of heroes formed by Ozymandias, like the new version of the Minutemen. In the comic, this is a bit different, as it was Captain Metropolis who wanted to form a second team of superheroes called Crime Busters, one through which he could feel the glory of being a hero again. However, just like in the movie, Eddie Blake interrupts the meeting, saying it's a stupid idea and burns the map before leaving. All these details make the opening feel like a beautiful and emotional historical and social puzzle that we as viewers have to put together. However, you don't need to understand all these cultural references to enjoy the movie, which is something I really like. However, all these details add an extra layer to the story and give us the feeling that we are immersed in a complex and highly political world. According to a writer involved in the film who spoke on a podcast, Warner Bros., the sequence was considered too expensive and complex to include, but I'm glad it wasn't removed in the end. Because all these details made this scene become my all-time favorite. And in my opinion, the jewel in the crown of Zack Snyder's filmography. If you enjoyed this video, check out these other videos where I also discuss Watchmen, one of my favorite topics. I have one where I go in depth about the history of the Minutemen and one where I analyze Rorschach. If you're reading this, you'll definitely like them. I am Go, the Geek Monitor, always looking beyond the obvious.